Shopify grows your business no matter how far or big you grow. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. Whether you're selling your fans' next favorite shirt or an exclusive piece of podcast merch, Shopify helps you sell everywhere. Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the US. Allbirds, Rothy's, Brooklinen, and millions of other entrepreneurs of every size across 175 countries. Plus, Shopify's award-winning help is there to support your success every step of the way. Because businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in.
Welcome back to Crime Capsule. I'm your host, Benjamin Morris. Let me start off just by saying thanks to everyone for joining us this past year for a really great third season of the show. We have had a fantastic run this time around, looking at topics ranging from paranormal to lost cities, from cold cases for the winter season to crimes of passion for the hot summer months. We even celebrated 100 episodes with some of our favorite authors and guests from the past few years. It's been a blast, and we are grateful. So, thank you. Today, we're dialing back the clock to just a few weeks ago, however, when we featured the hit new show, Watching Two Detectives, produced by Sarah Ferris for Evergreen Podcasts. We dropped that one on you almost without warning, partly because it was so good that as soon as it was released, we didn't want to wait any longer to share it. Well, today, as we get ready to wrap up Season 3, we're thrilled to have Sarah herself on to talk about it. Watching Two Detectives is blowing up the charts, and we are so excited to see where it goes. A longtime producer, educator, and expert storyteller across different forms of media, Sarah's work goes far beyond the download screen to have real, measurable impact out in the world. And it is our privilege to welcome her onto the show. Sarah, welcome to Crime Capsule.
Hi, thank you very much for having me, Ben.
It is a real pleasure. You know, this is our last episode of our third season, and we were so privileged to get to share one of your episodes of Watching Two Detectives a couple of weeks ago. It's really well done. Congratulations on that.
Thank you so much. There's a lot of love that's gone into that production, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's very apparent. I mean, it's incredibly skillfully produced, and it's a gripping case, and I'm sure that our listeners were on the edge of their seats as I was. No, let me ask you this. Before we talk about that particular show, you produce quite a number of different podcasts. How did you get your start?
Well, probably not like most people in podcasting. So my first podcast is called Conning the Con, and it all came about because my little sister actually swiped right on a serial con man. And when that happened, yeah, for real. So when that happened, we were kind of living in this Netflix drama. And for some reason, my sister Emma had the foresight to hit record and recorded literally 24 hours after she discovered what his real name was. And we sat on that recording and the unfolding drama that happened, which, by the way, was absolutely crazy. We sat on that audio for a while, and I was like, well, I don't know how to make a podcast, but I'm sure that I can work it out because I was a big podcast listener, especially to true crime. So I basically sat in my lounge and over COVID and got on GarageBand and pulled Conning the Con together. So that was my first podcast. And since then, I've done several others. That one and then the next one are unfortunately both stories that happened to family members. So I try and stay away from those now if I can.
Yeah, you don't want any more of those kind of hijinks affecting the folks that you
and I think people were starting to
love.
think I was the bad mojo in the family, I'm sure.
Oh no. Well, I doubt that very much on behalf of all of us here at Crime Capsule. So you mentioned that you had been interested in crime for a while. Was the criminal experience of your sister kind of the trigger for you to begin producing these things, or had you always had kind of the idea or kind of a glimmer or a spark of the notion?
I think I was always really interested in true crime, particularly, but I did a social work degree when I was at university. So I was always really interested in the justice system and, how we can reform when people go into prison and how effective that is. So society was something that was always interesting to me. And obviously that criminal element kept falling in my lap, unfortunately. So with my sister's case, and then, as I said, the next podcast I did was called Clueless, The Long Con. And that was actually a month after my little sister discovered she'd been conned. Literally the month after, my parents-in-law discovered that they were in one of the largest Ponzi schemes. And
wow.
Yeah, so it wasn't necessarily that I thought I would carry on doing true crime. In fact, I do have other podcasts that aren't crime related. I have a sustainability podcast and a wellness podcast. But true crime is really my passion because I like to make media with purpose is my tagline. And, hitting away from that old age of unethical true crime. I want to make sure that the stories really have purpose. And whether that's educating people on the red flags of con artists, which we do with psychologists and Conning the Con, or I have one with the former head of the FBI's active shooter program, Catherine Schweik, called Stop the Killing. And we discuss how we can make the community safer by being aware of, the hurdles that we can put in place to stop mass shootings, not just in America, globally. So, yeah, that's kind of the purpose. And that's where I've fallen, to be honest.
It is.
And I think when you're
I
think when you're in that space, those stories keep coming to you.
They find you after a while. You don't have to look as hard.
No, exactly.
Oh, I do want to ask you about Watching Two Detectives because it really is phenomenal. It is so well done. And it is such an interesting story. I mean, the case itself, of course, revolves around a very terrible murder. One of the worst acts of senseless, random killing that I certainly have encountered. But before we get to sort of the details of it, I mean, tell us how did this show get started? What was the origin of that?
Well, it's such a good, actually, segue from the last conversation we had because, when we're talking about stories finding you after a while, the reason that I connected with Scott and Peter, and this is an absolute, nobody else knows this. This is a Crime Capsule exclusive.
Oh, an exclusive.
An exclusive.
My goodness. Feel very special.
What happened was I had a listener of Conning the Con and Clueless reach out to me and want me to have a look into a specific person that they thought was also a con artist. Now, I mean, this story is crazy, but he was a fake admiral, essentially.
Wow. Okay.
So when I started pulling on the threads of the story of the Badmiral, stay tuned. That's the next podcast coming out.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Love it.
Love it fun.
Badmiral. That's great.
The Badmiral coming soon. So when I started pulling on the threads of like whether this guy was real or not, the two threads that I pulled first were Scott Rogan and Peter Hogan, who happened to be victims of the Badmiral. So that's how I met Scott. And so Scott, when I first talked to him, I was like, okay, I think this guy is a wrong-un, whatever. And we started just working together on trying to pull the threads of the Badmiral. And as that sort of relationship built, he was like, oh, do you know what? I've always sort of thought of there's some great stories of the work that we've done. And I've always wanted to do a podcast. And I was kind of a bit like, oh, well, everybody says that. Show me what you got. And the first recordings that we did, were completely sort of higgledy-piggledy. There was no direction. It was just these guys downloading. And then they would interview different people and blah, blah, blah. But then so we had lots of different sort of ideas for episodes. But what happened with this first season was the story is of Michael Furlong's murder. And when Scott and Peter reached out to Michael's family to say, listen, we'd like to cover Michael's murder in the podcast that we're thinking about creating, would you be okay? It was actually Luke, Michael's son, who was 10 at the time of the murder, and was now, as he picks up the phone to Scott and Peter, is now in his 30s. And he said, oh my gosh, I have been waiting 20 years to speak to the detectives that solved my father's case. And from that moment, we kind of like, the whole season just turned into something completely different and something really special. And I don't think there's not very often that you have the detectives that solve the case that have that full circle closure with the victim's family, because they are by design genuinely kept apart when the investigation's going on. So, it was a very different story that popped out of it, and I think probably unexpected for all involved.
Yeah. I have to say, in listening to the show and hearing the way that the family's voices are given just such prominence. I mean, you speak to Colleen, you speak to, their son, you speak to, of course, Pete and Scott, are sort of leading us through the case. You know what I found so interesting? I mean, number one was the way that you do give such airtime and sort of pride of place to how this affected them as a family and how willing and open they were to speak about it. It's very moving. Now, before we get to that point, we probably need to say what happened, right? I'm sure our listeners are sort of like, wait, what is this case even about? But we're 5 steps ahead there. Let's back up and just tell us a little bit about this particular incident, this murder, and why it was so gripping to everybody who was involved.
Well, I hope I can do it justice. It's been a while since I edited it, so
sure.
I mean, the story will obviously stay with me as it did with the detectives and everybody involved. Once you hear it, you can't unhear it. But simply, Michael and his brother had been going to an electronic shop to pick up items that were unbelievably Michael was designing something that would save people's lives and stop them falling asleep at the wheel. So he was picking up electronic components. Now, when he was in one of the stores, just by happenstance, by complete, sliding doors, he crosses paths with his murderer. And that guy in the CCTV footage, you can see stalking him. But it's not till Michael and his brother leave and go 15 minutes down the road to another electronics store that they actually talk for the first time. The brothers come out of the electronics store, and at that stage, there's an incident where the murderer gets Michael into a position where he is able to pull out a very large hunting knife and just slashes his throat, and there's no other way to say it. It is horrific and just entirely tragic. And those murders by strangers, I think, are probably some of the hardest to understand.
And just for context, we should say this happened about 20 years ago. This is in 2002, and it was in a small sort of neighborhood of Sydney in Australia called Smithfield.
That's right.
And it was fascinatingly, it was on a very busy intersection on a very busy road, which made the kind of the fact that this man committed the homicide in basically full view. It was getting dark. It was about 5 o'clock in the evening, but it was in full view on a very busy street, lots of traffic all around. And it was random. I mean, it was just completely random. There was no prior connection between the perpetrator and the victim whatsoever. And it was all these elements sort of come together to just make it shocking, but also perplexing. You know, I mean, as you're listening, you're sort of like, what?
Yeah.
What led to this? I mean, it's very, very strange in that respect. And there are, I think, quite a lot of unanswered questions as we learn more about it. How did you handle the unanswered aspect of it? The sort of sense of mystery and kind of confusion about how this all came to be.
I mean, I think there was just moments where I was just jaw on the floor as I was listening to the raw audio as I was going through editing. And there's moments in there where, you know, the perpetrator is actually like, I would consider him to be the definition of an evil genius. Because the lengths that he's gone to, and we uncover his past, it's just frightening, absolutely frightening. And then, you know, there's just so many twists and turns in it that there's even like, you know, I mean, it's just crazy. There's even like, is it poison toothpaste in there that he thinks he's being poisoned by his toothpaste and that he's being listened to by the Australian Federal Police. There's so many elements that are just like a James Bond movie supervillain. But yeah, I mean, the thing is, and I'd just like to go back also, Ben, and just say thank you so much for picking up on the fact that we gave the voices to the family so much, because one thing that I do in my other podcast is we don't name the perpetrators in the Stop the Killing because of the contagion effect with mass shootings. But it's also something I'm very conscious about, is to try and make the narrative bookended by the story of the family first and not the perpetrator. And I think it's important to understand how everything unfolded and why it unfolded, but also to always bring it back to that this person was somebody's loved one and really special.
You know, on Crime Capsule, our listeners know we talk a lot about the difference between aftermath and closure, and we actually don't really believe in closure. You know, closure is not something that many people get, and even then, it just doesn't prove to be that over time, right? We live in the aftermaths of these things, and it's very moving to hear how Colleen and the boys tried to reestablish a sense of normalcy after this. And she says very explicitly at one point, you know, after they lost their dad, that, you know, this is what he would have wanted for his sons, right? And it's sort of like, that touched me, you know, in a way. I was sort of like, yeah, that's exactly right. That is absolutely right. That, you know, she wanted to get them back into school, even though, you know, it was hard on them, and spend time with their friends again and so forth. And this thing is sort of following them around, but it's what he would have wanted for them to try to find a new way forward, right? And to make the very best, you know, out of an awful situation. And I just thought that it did such honor, you know, to his memory in that respect.
I thought that Colleen and Luke, you know, really special people to be able to share the worst moments of their lives with us so candidly and so honestly and very raw. But I thought it was there was a moment in the podcast where Colleen talks about, and I think it's probably in episode 4, where she talks about how she never wanted the boys to remember that day of Michael. That's not the day that she wanted them to remember, because everything before that, he was just such a loving father. And so, you know, he was bigger than that one day, and he shouldn't be defined by it.
No, that makes perfect sense. And just a really, really beautiful kind of testimony there. And I'll say that one of the things that makes, despite the tragedy, one of the things that makes learning about this case and journeying through it just so reassuring in a way is the presence of Peter and Scott. I mean, they're great, right? And the two of them are just, I mean, what a duo, you know, because I was kind of curious about their backstory because they slot right in.
Yeah.
And it is so impressive to hear them know in a very challenging situation where time is of the essence to know exactly what to do. And frankly, Sarah, I thought one of the most interesting sequences in the entire show was that early discussion of how they established the crime scene and established the perimeter around it, along with Clive, right there, sort of the other investigator, because one would think a naive or sort of a newish detective might think, well, the crime scene is focused on the body, right, or the body and the car, where he was murdered. But actually, it's much, much broader than that. And to hear them say, we've got to get this circle as wide as possible because we're going to have to collect every single little bit of evidence. I thought that was just such a shrewd move right out of the gate.
Yeah, and I think, you alluded to it earlier as well. I thought one of the things that stuck in my mind that was quite fascinating is when, I think it's Peter talking about how they have to interview the victims straight afterwards and how it is the hardest thing, like it really is the hardest thing to do, but they have to do it right because they only want to do it once for the victim's sake. And, that the way they honor that as well and are so mindful of it. Those are some buzzwords that wouldn't have been around 20 years ago, but they fit quite nicely in here.
Yeah, no, they do. And it is interesting because we should also say, just for sort of clarity, there were nearly 2 murders that night, right?
Right.
So the assailant does kill Michael, and he attempts to kill Michael's brother, who's able to sort of flee the scene in shock and in horror. He's able to sort of get away from, in the sort of heat of the moment, he is actually able to escape. And the assailant does not continue to pursue him after a time. And that actually proves very important, right? For the development of the investigation and so forth. But yes, to have to interview, Michael's brother right after that must have been just extraordinarily challenging. And I can only imagine for everybody involved, what that was like. But they handle it with such compassion and such skill. It's really remarkable. Now, in subsequent episodes, we learn a good bit more about the killer, and there's some really really strange things going on there. I'm not going to spoil them. We want everybody to have the chance to kind of listen for themselves and kind of dive a little deeper into this particular case. But it is interesting to me that quite early on, they do find a smoking gun, right? And the smoking gun happens to be the murder weapon in a car, and it is across town, right? So they find someone sleeping in a stolen car. I looked on the map, and Smithfield is not close to Centennial Park, where this car was found.
No,
it is not close. And so I was just kind of curious, how, when you learned about how much evidence was found in this particular vehicle with the assailant, associated with it and so forth, and they bring him in. Did you think, as you were hearing about this case, oh, they've got him, it's cut and dried, it's over, we're done here? Because that does not prove to be the case.
No, exactly. And I also think, the most incredible, and Clive always says it so well, he says, we had a bit of luck. And they had just a bit of luck. When they say luck, they had good policemen on the job who weren't related to that case at all, who happened to be doing their job and checking on a person sleeping in a car miles away from, as you say, the actual crime scene. So that was literally just, luck that those two kind of things happened. If the perpetrator had slept there overnight and been completely unwoken by that police putting the flashlight in the car, we have no idea what way it would have gone afterwards, because it could have been a lot worse in terms of victims. So they did a great job doing that. And then again, we have a sort of the sliding doors moments all the way through at the police station, where they take this guy to a different police station. And they've got to put those 2 and 2 together, and how they do that is quite incredible, Again, somebody who's just happens to be listening, who's not related to the case, but knows about the murder, is the person that puts that together and brings Clive over. So it's so many sliding doors that you think,
Yep.
wow, that case would not have been solved had it not been for those policemen on the beat knocking on that window.
It's remarkable. Yeah. The near misses, the number of sort of near misses and, sort of lucky strikes and that sort of thing is just
exactly.
They just keep piling on. They just keep adding up, and it's sort of
you're right. They think they've got
this
him.
can't be the case.
Yeah, and they think they've got him at that stage, but of course that turns out, it's just the start of a journey.
It is. And I want our listeners to be able to experience it for themselves because it really is an extraordinary story. Now, let us zoom out just a little bit here from the details of the case. And I'm curious, I wanted to ask you, Sarah, this is a little tricky question. I've got a couple of tricky questions, and they're tricky on my end.
Okay.
So I take responsibility for anything that is clumsily asked, but I'm going to try. Anyway, I'm curious, what was the larger profile of this case of Michael Furlong's murder? Did it have any impact on issues regarding public safety in the city of Sydney or the state of New South Wales? Did it have any? Did it result in any changes to sort of criminal law or how police handle homicides? You see what I'm getting at? It's kind of what was the impact larger once it was in fact resolved?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there was definitely impact. Some of it isn't resolved now, but one of the things that did get changed because of this case later years is that the criminal actually, the perpetrator actually changed his name whilst he was in custodial care, his last name, and the family were only informed of that after the fact. And that raised a lot of questions, about, why is somebody that's in, custodial care, and I don't want to give it too much about where he ended up, but he ended up in custody of some description. And should that person then be able to go and change their name? So that did change after this case, and you can now, people that are in the system cannot go and change their last name.
That's fascinating.
Thankfully, because obviously they get out and then there's no kind of history or link between what this person had done and who they have now presented themselves as. So that was one element of it.
No, that's great. That's very encouraging to hear that. Let me ask you another tricky question. And it's tricky because it is ever so slightly political. And it's a question, I suppose, from the perspective of an American who, does live in a country where we have the absolute highest rate of mass shootings, where gun violence is the number one leading cause, across the board, of homicides. And this case is set in a country, it took place in a country where gun laws are very, very tight. They are very strict. And Australian regulations on, what a person can and can't own and so forth are much, much more stringent than they are here. As a result, I have heard it said sometimes, Sarah, that, homicides, if you were forced to use other implements than a gun, like a knife, say, or, a cudgel or whatever it might be, homicides can be more personal, right? There's sort of more likely, you're more likely to have to know the person, there's a dispute, there's a beef. It's not just a random kind of act that you get. Does that hold any water to you? Or I mean, in your previous work on other shows, as you've explored, these kinds of topics, how do you see the relationship between, say, firearms controls and types of crimes occurring across these different contexts?
That is quite the doozy of the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
But
and let me just contextualize it by saying, I mean, here you have someone who purchases a very large hunting knife, and then uses it to commit, a murder hours or days later of somebody he doesn't know at all. Right? There's obviously a mental illness involved, but I mean, it is. In order to kill somebody with a knife, you have to get up close and personal. That's kind of what I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that's part of the interesting nature of this case, as well as trying to unpick what would motivate somebody to do that. And I think that it's quite chilling to think that somebody could come up to you and do that. Whereas with, as I mentioned before, I think I co-host a show called Stop the Killing with the former head of the FBI's active shooter program, Catherine Schweik.
Yeah.
And now we came at that podcast. It was literally created because of that question of me being outside the US, coming to her and saying, what is the deal? Why don't you just get rid of all the guns? And, over 4 seasons of Stop the Killing, I have learned that it is just not that easy to get rid of all the guns in America. You've got quite a nuanced problem there. But having said that, we always zoom out on Stop the Killing and look at other countries and what they're doing. And we recently did a case, an episode where we had Stephen Keogh, who is a former homicide detective from Scotland Yard, and Catherine on it. And he bought all the UK figures and smashed them against the US ones. And we kind of just always bring the research and the numbers. And it's not a political podcast at all. It's literally just, here's the numbers, here's the facts. Let's talk about, is this country doing it better? What can we learn from it? Is this country doing it better? Can we learn from it? And particularly, you talk about Australia. Australia's got the stringent gun laws because of the Port Arthur massacre. They had a massacre there, boom, straight away, guns, gun laws change. Same with New Zealand. We had the Christchurch mosque shootings.
That's right.
And, straight away, actions taken. But these are mechanisms of government that are a lot easier to move than the US setup. So it's really nuanced, but it's not hopeless either, is the one thing that I would say in the US. I mean, we know that we've had, just last year, we had a listener who was an assistant principal who wrote into us and said that because of the things that she'd learned in the podcast, they actually had a child with access to weapons, a 2-year plan, a list, imminent shooting.
Yeah.
And because they had all of the threat assessment teams and a see something, say something attitude and stuff that she'd learned from Catherine on the podcast, they swung into action and actually stopped a school shooting. So it's really, I cried a lot that day. We all did. It was incredible. And, when you look at the stats, even the recent FBI figures have come out for mass shootings for 2024, I think, or 23 rather, it would have been the year before. The year before it was 60. This year, I think it was, I don't want to get these numbers wrong, so don't quote me, but literally it was 2 less this following year. And I thought to myself, wow, one of those
because of your work
potentially is, that the message is getting out there and people are being active and making their community safe. So yeah, it's not hopeless, but everybody needs to be part of the solution.
That is extraordinary, and that is the best thing I have heard in weeks. I mean, I can understand the weeping, but you also must have just been on cloud 9 just for days on end.
I mean, when I say, I make media with purpose, when I did Conning the Con, it was, we stop one person being conned, job done, box ticked. And straight away, we had people writing in saying that. So when we did Stop the Killing, we had, this lofty goal that perhaps one day it might just slow something down or something might happen, but we never had that. So when that happened, it was like, job done, box ticked.
That's incredible.
I
love it. I've got 1 or 2 more questions for you, but I do want to ask, let's stay on that note of hope while we can. Working in true crime can sometimes be a dark place. I mean, we'd have to live for a while in a dark world. And it's mental illness. It can be any number of different things, which we have to kind of immerse ourselves in as we're researching and writing and producing and so forth. And somebody asked me this question recently, and I was very grateful to get to think about it. And I wanted to pass the same question on to you, which was, how do you get out of that hole? How do you get out of the deep end? How do you come back into the light and make yourself whole again, to find those notes of hope, or to, do you sort of find a room full of puppies and kittens and just say, everything's going to be okay, or take long walks, right. Absolutely. What do you do to kind of like bring yourself back to sanity and to, you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think on that, like, top note, of, if you asked me what I do to pull myself out of it, I go and hang out with my family. I go and, be with my animals, 3 cats, a dog, there's always a fur baby. But on a deeper level, I think what holds me to have that like recovery from those traumatic stories is that my purpose is always so strong in making them. And that is that, as hard as those stories are, there's a reason that I'm telling them, and there is a hope that somebody else will be protected from hearing it. And, and particularly, in watching Two Detectives, what has been quite unique is that it's been unexpected who's been helped by telling the story. And as you go through, the most powerful thing in the first season of watching Two Detectives is the what's the word? I'm trying to think of the right word. Like the healing for Luke Furlong, the son. And it's this arc of his story, starting out with the pain and then having this, all these years later, 20 years later, having this sort of, full circle moment. And he doesn't hide the fact that it is probably the best thing that he's ever had, more than all the therapy. So that's been quite unique. And I have to say, coming up in season 2 of watching Two Detectives, I've just finished it. It's 3 episodes, and it is the story of Hubert Hamosi, who was a taxi driver in Sydney who was killed by the youngest perpetrators that Scott and Peter ever dealt with. And it is a shocking case. But again, the unexpected side effect of making this and telling this story is that I received an email yesterday, which was the message from the daughter who is featured in the podcast, but not her voice. I actually would like read her words in the podcast, how incredibly honored it was. She felt she felt very honored, and that her father's memory was honored, and it was a really healing event for her as well. So I think, to answer your question, the very long way around, is I find hope and purpose.
Marvelous. That is more beautiful than I could have ever imagined. Thank you for that, Sarah. Now, season 2, we're all very excited about season 2 coming out. When might we get to put in our headphones and get to work?
And listen to it. Well, I don't know. I have not scheduled it yet, but I will, because I'm just. It was a very strong launch for season 1, so it kind of took me by surprise. And I need to get my A into G, as we say in New Zealand, and get it scheduled. So stay tuned; it'll be in the next month or so. But already season 3 is turning out to be quite the cracker of a series as well. So a lot to listen to. Exactly.
Watch this space. Well, we will with bated breath. Sarah, this is a pleasure. Tell us before we head off to the pub. Tell us, where can folks find you? How can they get a hold of your work, your shows?
Yeah, so probably the best place is my website. You can go to Sarah Ferris Media. conmunity.com. And you can follow me on Instagram at conmunity. That's con with an N, Conmunity Podcast. And of course, you can follow Watching Two Detectives as well on Instagram and on Twitter or X.
Yes, whatever they're calling it these days.
At Watching Two Detectives. There you go.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. We were just so privileged to get to share a little airtime, here on Crime Capsule, last few weeks come. So we're all super excited about what there is coming down the pike. Thank you so very much. This has been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening. Our guest has been Sarah Ferris, producer of Watching Two Detectives, available on evergreenpodcasts.com. Join us next week for a special bonus episode featuring a blast from the past and a brand new conversation. As ever, no spoilers, but we're looking forward to celebrating our community here in the next couple of weeks, and we will hope to see you then. Thanks as always to our producer, Bill Huffman, our production director, Bridget Coyne, audio engineer, Ian Douglas, and our executive producers, Michael D'Aloia and Gerardo Orlando. I'm your host, Benjamin Morris. Crime Capsule is a production of Evergreen Podcasts and a signature title of the Killer Podcasts Network. You can find Crime Capsule wherever you listen to podcasts. Discover more great true crime and paranormal programming at killerpodcasts.com.
Hey guys, I'm Margot.
And I'm Jenna.
And we're not just sisters, we're also the hosts of Death by Southwest,
your new favorite true crime must listen.
Each week, we dive deep into some of the most mind-blowing murder stories to ever occur in the American Southwest. We use a blend of storytelling and casual conversation so that each episode has the perfect balance of suspense, mystery, and humor. And here's the twist. Jenna becomes the voice of the audience. She steps into each episode knowing absolutely nothing about it and asking all the questions that you, the listener, want answers to.
New episodes drop each Tuesday, and you can listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts.
Death by Southwest. We never take ourselves too seriously, but we're dead serious about true crime.
I want to take a moment to tell you about my podcast, Carol Costello Presents Blind Rage. In 1984, a woman named Phyllis Cottle was abducted in broad daylight, tortured, and left to die in a burning car in Akron, Ohio. At the time, I was a rookie reporter covering this horrific story. Since then, I've reported every kind of crime imaginable. I've been able to leave most of them at work, but not this one, the one that buried itself under my skin and stayed put. Phyllis Cottle was a badass woman, and I want to tell you her story. A production of Evergreen Podcasts and signature title of the Killer Podcast Network, you can find Carol Costello Presents Blind Rage wherever you get your podcasts. Discover more great true crime and paranormal programming at killerpodcast.com.